You've seen him on Monster Quest, Ancient Aliens, Legend Hunters, Unexplained Files. He's been on Animal Planet, Sci-Fi, Travel Channel, National Geographic, and the Discovery Channel. He also probably saw him when he co-hosted his show, Missing in Alaska, but we found him. He's right here. Please give a big hand for Mr. Ken Gerhard.
Thank you. Great job, Howard. Appreciate it. Thank you, folks. Feel free to continue and eat if you need to. Try to make this kind of like dinner theater, if you like. It's always great to be here at the Texas Bigfoot Conference. This is actually one of my favorite conferences to speak at because I feel like I'm talking to my family, basically. I see so many familiar faces, friends that I've gotten to know through the years. I didn't make the first Texas Bigfoot Conference, but I was here for the second one in 2002, and I've attended most of them since that time, so it's always a great event. I really was struggling with a topic for this year's lecture, so I was, I wanted to come up with something kind of new, different, fresh, and then it occurred to me the skeptics' rallying call, which is, where's the body, right? You've all heard that, probably most of our skeptical friends. Or to use the Jerry Maguire version, show me the body. So, we have a great mountain of that. People that are skeptics often ask me, hey, why should we believe in Bigfoot? And I tell them, well, there's really a mountain of evidence. If you look at all the thousands of documented eyewitness sightings, you look at the Native American legends all over the world, you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film, you look at the footprints, everything. It's like, it's pretty convincing for me. I've been investigating Bigfoot for over 40 years now. Yeah, I know, over 40 years, believe it or not. But we don't have that smoking gun, that physical evidence, but have we come close? And looking at it purely objectively, it seems like after many, many years of encountering these relict hominoids, to use Jeff Meldrum's term, around the world, it seems like at some point there would have been an opportunity to have definitive proof or evidence. And so we're going to talk about some of the accounts of Bigfoot either being killed or captured around the world. Believe it or not, we have a number of accounts of those, and we don't have a body to show for it, but some of these I think might be worth considering. And to use my good friend Shelley's term, some of these are going to be stories, some of these are presumably stories, some of these might be actual accounts based on real incidents. So one other thing I'm going to say is that in addition to being a Bigfoot investigator, I'm also consider myself, or fancy myself, to be a Bigfoot ethnographer and barometer. And so I like to, if I can ask all of you to kindly do a little bit of audience participation, because I'm going to be asking basic survey questions about who's heard of this and who hasn't heard of that. And that's of interest to me. I was at a Bigfoot conference in Oklahoma a couple of weeks ago, and I asked about a room full of about 200 people who had ever heard of Bob Titmus, and not a single person raised their hand, which was shocking to me. So who's heard of Bob Titmus? Anybody? Okay, so after Bob Gimlin, Bob Titmus is probably the greatest Bigfoot tracker ever. He was a huge contributor to the field. So we're going to bring the lights down, and hopefully my eyes will adjust enough to where if I ask you guys to raise your hands, I'll be able to see. So here we go, Bigfoot. This should be fun. Bigfoot captured or killed. By the way, I'm not necessarily a proponent of Bigfoot being killed. I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression there. Okay, well, we're going to start with some of the classics. Who's heard the story of Jacko? It's a Bigfoot classic, well documented by John Green and others. But this was a newspaper article that appeared in a British Columbia newspaper back in 1884. The date's actually on July 4th, 1884 is supposed to be the date, but the story of Jacko, which long predates stories of Sasquatches and Bigfoots. This is in an area of British Columbia, very near Harrison Hot Springs, Sasquatch Provincial Park. So it's an area that has a long history and tradition of Sasquatch accounts by the local natives. But according to this newspaper article, on July 4th, 1884, there was a train traveling about 20 miles north of Yale, British Columbia, and as they came out of a tunnel, the conductor, a guy named Ned Austin, saw a body lying on the side of the tracks. And they blew the horn, and we were able to stop and break the train. And just as they did, this creature, what they called a creature, stood up and basically started climbing some steep bluffs next to the railroad tracks. Well, because the train was ahead of schedule, some of the railroad conductor and some other people on the train decided to give chase. And they actually were able to climb up these steep bluff, and this thing was stuck on a ledge. And so the train's conductor, a guy named R.J. Craig, climbed about 40 feet above this figure and dropped a rock on its head, rendering it unconscious. I know that sounds barbaric, but... And then they were able to lower the body down with ropes onto the train. And word of the capture got into Yale, British Columbia, so there were people waiting at the train station to see this thing when it was brought in. But the physical description is something of the gorilla type. That sounds very British, right? Something of the gorilla type, standing about 4 feet 7 inches tall, weighing about 127 pounds. They said it was very human-like, except it was completely covered in shiny black fur, or hair, very long hair. And that had a very human-like face. In addition to that, they described it as being very, very strong, having long arms and very strong, and it was wrenching and twisting branches. This thing was offloaded, supposedly, at the Yale train station and was turned over to a man named Mr. Tilbury, who was going to become the caretaker and transport this strange being back to England to exhibit it. They kept this thing for a couple of days, supposedly, and we're feeding it berries and milk, but the local doctor said don't give it any raw meat because that might bring out its aggressive nature. So this is, I think most Bigfoot researchers consider this an old newspaper hoax. It is a very colorful story, of course, except for the fact that John Green, who's heard of John Green? Oh, thank goodness, okay. John Green was able to, through the years, track down a handful of eyewitnesses, or people at least that lived in Yale, British Columbia around this time period in 1884. Of course, they were very old at the time that John Green talked to them. And some of them verified that, yes, I remember hearing about this when I was growing up in Yale, that this strange gorilla-like creature was captured and transported. Now, the real mystery is what happened to Jacko, because the body evidently disappeared in transport. No one ever really heard of what happened to it after it left the Yale, British Columbia, and supposedly was heading east to the East Coast. An interesting theory was put forth by Dr. Grover Krantz. Who's heard of Dr. Grover Krantz? Thank you. Dr. Grover Krantz, great physical anthropologist and Bigfoot researcher, had a theory that perhaps what happened was that Jacko was shipped east and purchased by P.T. Barnum and put on display as Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy in 1884. Because that was the first year that P.T. Barnum featured an exhibit called Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy, which may have in fact matched the description of Jacko. However, in 1885, there are pictures of Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy with the P.T. Barnum circus, and at that point it's a young man with hypertrichosis, which of course is a very rare genetic condition where they have a hair-covered face. So a real mystery involving Jacko, but perhaps we had at one time a juvenile, presumably a juvenile Sasquatch, in captivity, although again, it may just be a great story. And of course, the famous 8 Canyon incident. Who's heard of the 8 Canyon incident? Of course, one of the classics, once again. So this occurred in July of 1924, allegedly, long before the names Bigfoot or Sasquatch had entered the public vernacular. And the story goes that there were, this gentleman on the left up here, here he is, a little old, I got a pointer here. This is Fred Beck, as he's a little older. This is a young Fred Beck. Fred Beck and 4 other prospectors, miners, were up in an area in the shadow of Mount St. Helens, Washington, and in July of 1924, and they had a little cabin up on this, above the canyon, near the Muddy River, about 20 miles from Spirit Lake. And according to the story, they started finding large human-like tracks on the sandy beaches. And this had apparently been going on for years from what they discussed. And then soon after that, they apparently saw one of these creatures peeking at them from behind a tree, and one of the miners actually fired off several rounds at the thing and was convinced that he had hit the thing in the head 3 times, even though it ran off. And then that particular evening is when all heck broke loose. And supposedly their cabin, their lean-to, was attacked according to them, by several of these Bigfoot-like creatures. Now, again, this was long before the name Bigfoot or Sasquatch had entered the public vernacular, so at that time they were calling them mountain gorillas or mountain devils. And these things were throwing rocks down on their lean-to, they were banging on the walls. Supposedly, in one dramatic moment, a large hairy arm reached through one of the cracks in the lean-to and tried to grab an axe, and they were able to fend it off. They were firing, of course, their guns outside. So this was after this long, harrowing evening. They came out the following morning and they gathered all of their belongings and got the heck out of there. And they immediately went down and reported what happened to them to some of the local officials, and it made the local newspapers. And so it's a very well-known story of a alleged Sasquatch attack. Now, the reason this is a Bigfoot captured or killed story is that the following morning after they came out of the cabin, according to Fred Beck, who later wrote this book, I Fought the 8 Men of Mount St. Helens, what a great title that is. He actually saw one of these things, looking at them, and he shot it, and it fell off a precipice down into Ape Canyon below. So they were not able to retrieve the body because this thing had fallen into the valley. But again, an account of a Bigfoot being shot in a body falling down into the canyon. Now, there's a discrepancy in terms of how many of these creatures actually did attack their cabin. At one time, Fred had mentioned, or some of the miners had mentioned, that as many as 8 of these things had attacked them. But truth be told, they really only could verify that maybe there were 2 of them attacking the cabin, because they could hear one running around on the roof and they could hear one banging on the walls at the same time, so who knows. But this particular area of Washington State is in Skamania County, which of course has a county ordinance protecting Bigfoots from being shot or captured. And of course, it's also near the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest and some other areas where there have traditionally been a lot of sightings of Bigfoots or Sasquatches. Now, why this is noteworthy, and perhaps not just a story, even though it's a great story, is that 1924 was long before J.W. Burns had ever written the first article about Sasquatches in British Columbia. Who's heard of J.W. Burns? This one's a little trickier. Okay, he was a teacher that basically brought the name Sasquatch into prominence based on Native American stories. Now, in recent years, an investigator from Washington State named Marcel actually became interested in the Ape Canyon story, and he spent a lot of time digging through old archives, investigating the stories, and actually believes he has located the location where the cabin was set up. And he's taken Shelley Covington, Montana, and some other researchers up to this particular area where they did find old rusty nails and tools and things like that, which led them to believe that this was the location. So again, we at least have a verification that the cabin probably did exist at one time. So this may in fact be based on real incidents. Okay, and this is one I write about in my latest book, the story of the Minnesota Iceman. Who's heard of the Minnesota Iceman? Okay, it's a pretty well-known story. Incidentally, currently the Minnesota Iceman exhibit is being housed at the Museum of the Weird in Austin, Texas. So if anyone's down in Austin, Texas, you can actually go and see the Museum of the Weird, the Minnesota Iceman exhibit. This is kind of a long and in-depth story, so I'll try to abbreviate it as much as possible. Now, I may be in the minority in terms of Bigfoot researchers that think that this may be based on an actual physical specimen. I think most people think that the Minnesota Iceman was probably just a clever hoax, but I'll tell you why I don't think it was. Here's the story. And incidentally, the Minnesota Iceman means a lot to me personally, because when I was a young man, back in 1976, right after the first time I'd seen the Patterson-Gimlin film on TV and just became completely obsessed with Bigfoot, I was at the Minnesota State Fair and I saw the Minnesota Iceman. So this was something that I kind of grew up with that was very important to me. But according to the story, beginning in the 1967, this gentleman, Frank Hansen, was traveling around to different Midwest carnivals and fairs, exhibiting what he described as a hairy man-like creature entombed in a block of ice. And he had this thing in like a modified semi-trailer truck that you could go up and look at it. The exhibit was visited by a young veterinary student named Terry Cullen. beginning in 1968. And Terry Cullen went and saw this thing several times, and he looked at it through the ice and thought, this is real. This is not some kind of dummy or fabrication. This is a real flesh and blood, whatever it is, creature. And he tried in vain to get some scientists to come and look at it, which they wouldn't. He finally reached out to a guy named Ivan T. Sanderson. Has anyone heard of Ivan T. Sanderson? Very good. Ivan T. Sanderson is one of the founders of cryptozoology. And he became convinced that Terry was very sincere and that it was worth traveling from New Jersey to Minnesota, where this thing was being kept on this guy's property in his shed. And at the time, this is Ivan Sanderson here on the right, author of a book called Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. If you want to be a Bigfoot investigator, you have to read that book. It's like must read. His house guest at the time was none other than Dr. Bernard Hovelmans, who was the other father of cryptozoology. So they decided to travel out to Minnesota and take a look at this thing. And Frank granted them access for 3 days. Now, keep in mind, this thing was entombed in ice. He wasn't going to melt the ice. He said it belonged to somebody else. His original story was this thing belonged to a mysterious millionaire in California. It had been found in Hong Kong, that it was originally found by some Russian sealers that were founded in a block of ice floating in the ocean. So there was a long story, and admittedly, Frank Hansen changed his story a few times, which is why people think this may be a hoax. But these two esteemed zoologists examined the body of this thing for 3 days straight. They took measurements, photographs. They claimed they could smell, there were cracks in the ice, and they could actually smell the putrefaction of this thing's rotting body and see gaseous bubbles. So they were convinced that this thing is real. Frank Hansen asked them, please do not publicize your findings. Well, they, unfortunately for him, they did. Just a few months later, Bernard Hovelmans wrote a scientific paper, claiming that this was in fact a recently dead Neanderthal man. And the description of the Minnesota Iceman, if you're interested, is standing about 6 feet tall, very bulky and powerful, weighing about 250 pounds. They could tell by looking through the opaque ice that it was covered in hair, that it had a death grimace on its face, very powerful hands and feet. And what's really creepy is that it appeared to have a gunshot wound in its head. One of its eyes was blown out by this gunshot wound, and it appeared to have a broken arm where another bullet. So this thing looked like it had been shot by somebody. So look at some of the pictures here. Well, we got those. So these are some of the original photographs that they took up here, and I'm sorry they're not very good prints, but you can see its mouth, its nose, there's its death grimace, its hands. These are recreations of the Minnesota Iceman based on the original scientific drawings and by Hovelmans and Sanderson, and then other artists kind of taking some license with it. So Hovelmans was convinced that this thing was a living Neanderthal man. Ivan Sanderson, who wrote an article for Argosy magazine, thought that it was not a human, but he didn't know what it was. But they were both convinced that it was a hominoid, a man-like form that was not human, not Homo sapiens. Now, just after these articles came out, allegedly the FBI became very interested in the story of the Minnesota Iceman because this thing looks very human. It's been shot, and you've got it frozen in a block of ice, and you're taking around the country charging people to look at it. That seems a little bit suspicious. So right about the time they began to ask Frank Hansen questions about the thing, he disappeared from the scene for a few months and then reappeared a few months later announcing that he had had a latex replica of the Minnesota Iceman produced and that he was going to now be touring with the latex replica while he put the other one into storage. So that's where it gets a little fishy. It's like, okay. And this has been verified that he did have this latex version created, this duplicate. So the question then becomes, was it always a latex dummy that he had on display? And did he somehow fool two eminent zoologists who studied it for 3 days? Or was he covering himself and basically he didn't want to get in trouble, so he just still wanted to keep his line of income going, so he kept touring around with the Minnesota Iceman and so on and so forth. So if you travel down to Austin, Texas and go to the Museum of the Weird, you can look at the one they have on display there and you can make your own determination whether you think it's latex, probably, or the real thing. But the question is, was there at one time an original flesh and blood Minnesota Iceman? Now it's worth pointing out, in addition to Ivan Sanderson and Bernard Heuvelmans and Terry Cullen, there were two other scientists, a zookeeper named Bob Serpleski and an environmental scientist named David Rivard, who also saw the Minnesota Iceman in the 1960s and thought it was real. So you have several credentialed academics that studied this thing or saw this thing in the 60s that thought at one point the Minnesota Iceman was real. Now, if it was real, the great question, of course, where's the body? That would be great to find. Okay, I'm going to get a sip of water because I'm getting a little bit parched. Okay, so we come into some other stories. Now, most of the stories of Bigfoots or Sasquatch-type creatures being captured or killed are from Asia. Surprising number of accounts from that particular continent. And one of the most famous involves a Russian colonel and doctor named Lieutenant Colonel V.S. Karpetyan. Has anyone ever heard this story? A few of you. Okay. In 1941, he was stationed in southern Russia in the Republic of Dagestan in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. And local officials came to him one day and said, "We need you to examine this thing that we've captured. We don't know if it's a man, a spy, basically in a clever disguise, or something else." So Karpetyan was led out to this shed, and he asked them, "Why are you keeping this thing out in this cold shed?" And they said, "Well, it sweats so much, we can't keep it indoors." So he went in and examined this thing, and according to Karpetyan, this thing stood about 6 feet tall, towered over him, very powerful, very hairy. He studied it. He said that it did not appear to be human. It had a very dull, animalistic look in its eyes. It was not, he tweezed some of the hairs out of it and it didn't flinch. He said, this isn't a costume. This isn't a man in a costume. This is a real hair-covered man-like creature. This is one interpretation, an older interpretation, and a newer version. There's two versions of the wild man. It's worth noting that the Caucasus Mountains in Russia have a long-standing tradition of Bigfoot-like creatures known as almas. Has anyone heard of almas or almasti? Yes. Or kaptar. There's a couple of different local names, probably even more than that. Karpetyan later learned that this thing supposedly had been taken out back and shot unceremoniously and buried. That's the story. But at one time, the Russian army in 1941 may have had some type of relic hominoid that was in their possession. Here's a picture of Lieutenant Colonel V.S. Karpetyan, along with Russian investigators Dmitry Bayanov and Jean-Marie Hoffman, two leading researchers of the almas or almasti. Does anyone recognize this guy? René Dahinden? Has anyone heard of René Dahinden? Okay. René Dahinden took the Patterson-Gimlin film to Russia in the early 70s and was trying to get it analyzed there since American scientists ignored it. Okay, the Pamir Mountains are in southern Russia, east of the Caucasus, and in 1925, Major General Mikhail Topilsky, I'm part Russian, so I should be able to pronounce that, was chasing a bunch, he and his troops were chasing a bunch of white Russians, which incidentally is what I'm going to be doing right after this event, but I digress. Chasing a bunch of white Russians through the Pamirs, and they supposedly got in a firefight near some caves, and a bunch of these hairy man-like creatures started coming out of the caves, and one of them was shot to death with a machine gun. And Topilsky and some of his crew examined this creature, and they said it wasn't human, it was covered in hair. It wasn't real big and muscular. It appeared to be like elderly and kind of had grayish, brownish fur. But again, kind of an almas or an almasti type of creature. No account or description as far as what may have happened to the body. So again, potentially another Now you can understand when you're dealing with a war, there's a war going on or a battle or a military exercise, why these Bigfoot type creatures might get caught in the middle, shot due to friendly fire, and then of course it's just at that point it's not important enough perhaps to deal with that situation. Another way of looking at it is in terms of culturally, because in other cultures around the world, captures of quote-unquote wild men which Nick was talking about. That's kind of one of the old terms for these hair-covered man-like creatures, wild men. A lot of these accounts are, in other countries, people are more, it seems like they're more adept to dealing with that possibility. So, you read a lot of the accounts from China, Russia, other parts of Asia, Sumatra, is like, oh yeah, somebody's got a wild man over there down the street. It's not a big deal, so. Okay, this next account is going to be dealing with the Chinese version of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, known as the Yeren. Has anyone ever heard of the Yeren? Okay, Yeren is again a translation for wild man. Mostly reported from the Hubei province of central China. I'm going to be talking about a specific incident where supposedly a Yeren was paraded through a village bound in heavy chains. Oh, wait a minute, I skipped one. Here it is. You have no idea how hard it is to find a photo of a Yeren bound in heavy chains. But according to the story, in 1922, 3 different villagers in a small town in the Hubei province of China claimed that they witnessed the military parading a Bigfoot-type creature bound in chains through town. And that thing stopped a couple times. They sat it next to a tree, and they all described it as standing about 6.5 feet tall. And the soldiers told them it was one of the small ones, very powerful, covered in reddish-brown hair, with very large hands and feet. In addition to this account, there's a story, what happened to that? They had it in chains, they were marching it through this town, but nobody really talks about what happened to it after that. Another account from China is from 1940. In the Gansu province of northern China, there was a biologist no doubt, named Wang Jilin, who was riding a bus, and suddenly the passengers on the bus heard gunshots ahead, and they thought it was maybe bandits, so they got worried. But when they reached the spot where they'd heard the gunshots coming from, there was a crowd gathered around something. They got out and looked, and they said, "We've shot a wild man." And according to this biologist, he actually was able to look at the body, and it was, according to him, a female because it had breasts, a hair-covered Bigfoot-like creature with very high cheekbones, deep-set eyes. And I don't know why these guys shot it. I mean, that's kind of unfortunate. But here again, we have a story or an account from an actual biologist who claims that he examined a Bigfoot-like creature that had been shot and killed in 1940. So many of these types of stories from China. Okay, I'm going to backtrack because I skipped one. Okay, this is another interesting story. Refers to something called the rock apes of Vietnam. Has anyone ever heard of that? Okay, so you have a lot of stories coming out of Vietnam during the Vietnam War of soldiers in the jungle encountering something that looked very much like a Bigfoot. They called them rock apes. And they said they were obviously ape-like, and they were up on the rocks, and often these soldiers would come back and say that these things were caught in friendly fire, that they were very aggressive, and they would throw rocks at the soldiers. There's even an account, believe it or not, of an entire regiment doing battle with these rock apes. I don't know how valid any of these are, but at some point, some of these rock apes were supposedly killed or shot by friendly fire. And the soldiers would look at them, and they, at the time, again, they're in the middle of a heated war. They're in the jungle. They don't really have time to deal with this, but, they would make note of it or whatever. Now, backtracking a second to the Minnesota Iceman story, Bernard Heuvelmans actually thought that one of these rock apes might be the source of the Minnesota Iceman, that perhaps some engineering, for example, Frank Hansen, who was a fighter pilot in the Vietnam War, some enterprising soldier, or Frank Hansen, may have actually gotten hold of one of these rock ape bodies, which is a Bigfoot, and put it in a body bag and smuggled it back to the United States in a body bag as a GI. So, interesting theory there. It's also worth noting that Vietnam also has accounts of something called the Ngoi Rong, which is basically translates to wild man. So again, we kind of have this back and forth between ape and man, but all of these beings are described as being very similar, basically hair-covered, man-like creatures. See where I'm at on time. I have a tendency to babble. Okay, I've got a couple more minutes, I think. If a giant hook comes out here, we'll know. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go through some of the other stories real quick, because there's so many of them, guys. What about the Yeti, the abominable snowman? Yes, there are accounts. Okay, yeah, you good, yeah. I'd be real scared if you... Yeti, what's that? Okay, so the Yeti or abominable snowmen, many accounts of those being killed, and even a couple of accounts of them being killed and eaten, believe it or not. There's one account from Assam of some soldiers shooting a Bigfoot or a Yeti and eating it. I don't know what would have provoked that, but... And an interesting paradox there, because a lot of the Yeti stories talk about how it's bad luck to even look at a Yeti or talk about a Yeti, so why the heck are you going to eat one, right? Going back to the Almasty, which has been reported not only in Russia, but also in Mongolia, there's an account from 1937 of a Russian investigator named Dorji Marin, who claims he saw an almas skin that was being used as a ceremonial rug in a monastery in the Gobi Desert. At a Buddhist monastery, they actually had an almas skin, this human-like creature. It's pretty grisly, right? That they're using like a rug. And there's also an account from the 1950s from a place called Bulgan Station in central Mongolia of a gentleman who claims that he came across an almas body that was just basically decaying and rotting there. And again, just similar descriptions, hairy man-like creature. What about the Americas? Well, we have this guy, Buckskin Joe, Jonathan Edward Hoyt, a very colorful pioneer, adventurer, and prospector, claimed that in the late 19th century that he shot a gorilla-like creature that was climbing over his bunk in Honduras, Central America. Similarly, a guy named Richard Oglesby Marsh, who wrote a book about the Indians of Panama, has an account of a gorilla-like, 6-foot gorilla-like creature being shot in Panama. And then we also have accounts of the orang pendek in Sumatra being captured and killed. The Mapinguais, I mean, we heard of Brazil's Bigfoot, the Mapinguais supposedly being killed. So many accounts around the world. Now, there are a lot of hoaxes, obviously. And I don't want to go in too much into the hoaxes because a lot of them will sort of unintentionally give recognition to some people out there that are basically just trying to pull the wool over our eyes, right? There are many people in recent years that have claimed to have killed or shot a Bigfoot here in North America. And frankly, they seem to be doing it for dubious reasons. So if any of you guys want to talk about that later, I know a lot of these accounts have been highly publicized. Some of them I'm convinced are hoaxes. Others, I'm about 99% sure they're hoaxes. No one in North America, to my knowledge, has actually killed or shot a Bigfoot, at least in recent years. Before I wrap up, I think it's important to talk about two other older potential, not hoaxes necessarily, but perhaps one may be a hoax, one might be a misidentification, but there's just so much misinformation being floated out there these days. And I think one of my main responsibilities as a presenter is to separate the wheat from the chaff and give you guys the real story to the best of my ability, or at least what I understand to be the real story. Excuse me. So this is Igor Burtsev, who is a Russian hominologist, Bigfoot researcher. Igor is holding in his hand the skull of a gentleman named Quit. Quit was supposedly the descendant of a Russian wild woman named Zhanna. Has anyone heard of the story of Zhanna? So, very good. So the story of Zhanna is that back in 1850, in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Russian state of Georgia, this quote-unquote wild woman covered in hair was captured by local villagers, kept chained up. She was supposedly incapable of speech, covered in hair, very powerful. She was eventually trained to do different chores. She was incredibly strong, according to stories. And then eventually she began to get with some of the local guys, which is probably inappropriate to talk about. And she had some children, some descendants and grandchildren. And the story of Zhanna is very famous in the Bigfoot world, so they did track down the skull of her son Quit. I think I have a picture of Quit on the right, and this is one of her descendants on the left-hand side. And Igor, bless his heart, is still presenting Zhanna as a Bigfoot story at Cult. I'm not trying to pick on Igor, but just a couple weeks ago he was telling people about how Zhanna, this Bigfoot-type creature, was killed. Well, the skull was examined by a number of physical anthropologists beginning in the 1970s, including Dr. Grover Krantz, who looked at it and immediately said, this is 100% Homo sapiens. There's absolutely no primitive characteristics in the skull, there's no Neanderthal traits whatsoever. It is a human being. And in recent years, beginning with the TV show Monster Quest, and most recently Dr. Brian Sykes, geneticist from Oxford University, did DNA tests on some of Zhanna's descendants, and what they found was almost as remarkable as the Bigfoot DNA, I think, which is the fact that Zhanna appeared to be sub-Saharan African descent. That is, she was from West Africa and somehow ended up in the Caucasus Mountains in 1850. And the prevalent theory is that she was brought there as a slave. There's an even more far-out theory that maybe there was a migration out of West Africa into Russia thousands of years ago. The very sad part of the story is that, Zhanna was obviously of African descent. She was not a beast, she was not an animal, and perhaps she was treated as such and portrayed as such. But it is pretty remarkable still that you have this African lineage or heritage in the mountains of Russia. So it's kind of it's an interesting story, even though it's a little sad. And finally, we have the story of Dubois' ape. I'm sure all of you have heard about this or seen it on TV shows. This photograph was taken in 1920 by a Swiss geologist named Francois Dubois. And he was in the area between Colombia and Venezuela, South America, looking for oil. And by 1920, his 30-man expedition had died down to about 5 people. They had all been killed off by local natives or died of horrible diseases and so on and so forth. And despite the fact that they were in really bad shape in 1920, they claimed that one day these 2 ape-like creatures walked out of the jungle on their hind legs and aggressively, confronting them and defecating in their hands and throwing it at them, breaking branches, and that they shot one of these creatures, a female, and that they propped her up on a box with a stick and took a picture of her. And this photograph later resurfaced in Europe, and a guy named Montadon, who was a famous French primatologist, said, oh, we have evidence now there is a species of ape in South America. Well, through the years, this photo has been shown many times to represent an unknown man-like, ape-like creature, when in fact most academics now agree that it is in fact a spider monkey, which is a very common species of monkey in South America, potentially a very large spider monkey, and maybe it looks even large, and its tail is obscured. So, I mean, that would be the $1 million answer right there. If we could see its tail, we would know conclusively it was a monkey. Dubois swore it did not have a tail, and it was more man-like. The real mystery here is, why would a guy who was basically starving to death in the jungle of South America take the time to shoot a monkey, prop it up on a box, take a picture, and then present it to the world as a new species? That is a mystery that we perhaps will never solve, but we're like 99.9% sure that this does in fact show a large bloated dead spider monkey. So again, mystery solved. So in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that a lot of these accounts of Bigfoots being captured or killed are, again to borrow my friend Shelley's phrases, these are just stories. We don't have the smoking gun, we don't have the body, we don't have the physical proof that any of these things existed. But in retrospect, this may be one of the most skeptical lectures that I've ever given. Because when you consider dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds of accounts of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yetis being shot, killed, or captured, it seems like by now we would have at least one body, one bone, one piece of hard physical evidence that somebody had the forthright sense of mind to store away, to save, and to preserve. But unfortunately, we don't have that yet. But I guess I'm done. I'm going to appreciate you guys' time. Hope you enjoyed that. And I'll be over here if you want to come talk to me later.
Gerhard, check out his book.